So I'm going to try something different today. I'm going to try to go off script completely, other than some notes that I've taken, because I think it's important to demonstrate the power of what it means to be vulnerable. So here I am before you this morning. I will cheat, though. So many of you know, I've talked about it before, that I grew up Southern Baptist. So Southern Baptist is a part of the evangelical Christian tradition. And a major tenet of the evangelical Christian tradition is the goodness and the grace and the mercy of God, and through that of Jesus Christ. Now, theology aside, something that I loved about that tradition is the way that that joy in Jesus and that joy in God is shown and displayed during times of worship and also during times of mourning and of loss. The way that people connect in those spaces and the way that it means for us to witness that in one another in those moments. So it makes me think of one of the elders of that community that I grew up in, the church that I grew up in, named Miss Ruth. Now, Miss Ruth, I think she was born at 85. I can't imagine her ever having been a child or even a young adult. In my mind, she sprang into action with gray hair. She stood all of 5'3", maybe, and I feel like I could just pick her up and sling her over my arm. But when she would hear something that spoke to her heart, when she would hear about the goodness of God, whether it was through song or through something the choir sang or through something the preacher said, she would praise the Lord and blow the roof off of the house. I thought I'd be bold enough to demonstrate that, but alas, I won't put you guys through that this morning. But she could blow the roof off of that house. And I remember that as a kid. I remember that as a teenager. And I'm not very reverent to this day, so I definitely wasn't very reverent as a teenager. But even in those moments of her doing something so startling to us all, screaming to high heavens when she'd hear something she resonated with, even in my irreverence as a teenager, I could pause and find the beauty and the sanctity in what she was doing, that boldness, that bravery, and the desire to show the world that she believed and that touched her heart and that touched her soul. So fast forward many, many, many moons to about this time last month. Reverend Nancy is preaching on the seed within a seed, and she's using the story from the Upanishads. And she says a phrase that I have to cheat to see, and it's pure and unadulterated possibility. She's talking about this pure and unadulterated possibility that resides within each of us. And in that moment, I wanted to pull a Miss Ruth. I wanted to blow the top off of this building because I resonated so deeply with that as a spiritual humanist. I resonate with the power and the potential in the human spirit. I revel in what we can do together. I believe in us as people, as humans, in our capacity to build and to grow and to adapt and to create. So her talking about the seed within the seed and the possibility and the pure potential of each of us made me want to praise the universe. And yet I sat there and didn't do anything. I didn't feel like it would have been appropriate. I felt like it would have been too vulnerable. It would have startled people too much. People would have looked at me. There was a million things going through my head, even as a person of faith, even as a person who stands up here before you all the time, every week. Even in those moments, me sitting right there, I thought, I can't show how I feel in this moment. So I contrast that with the experience that I just experienced. So I just got back from Miami, Florida a week ago. This time last week, instead of sitting in this room, I was actually literally sitting on a beach. I was there for an annual conference of Unitarian Universalist religious professionals of color. This conference is called Finding Our Way Home. And the point of this conference is for us all to come together as religious professionals of color among our colleagues and our friends and our peers, to connect, to worship, to recognize each other in the joys and the triumphs and the struggles of being a Unitarian Universalist, and really to be together, to learn and to grow. Now, the beauty of finding our way home, one of the things, is that it grows every year. So go us. It grows every year. There are more and more religious professionals of color, and that's an amazing thing. Another thing that is really beautiful about this conference is that it's not so much about the programming. It's not about the keynote speaker, of which there isn't one anymore. They went away from that model. It's because it shows us that there are different ways to be a Unitarian Universalist. In fact, when we all gather together in that space, what makes it magic is not that we're all the same, it's that we're all different. It's that there's so many different ways of being a Unitarian Universalist. There's so many different ways of showing our devotion and our love for one another and for our shared faith. There's so many different ways of being in this world. And when we come into that space, we get the permission to live into those different ways. We don't have to conform to each other because we get it. And we get it without having to say it, and there's something very, very beautiful about that. So I think of it finding our way home, the permission that I get there, the ways that it's so easy for me there to emote, to show how I feel, to be in that space and in that moment. Something that's incredibly on my mind often are the standards of perfections we put on ourselves. I think in our larger world, in internet culture, there's fact-checking. Who's been fact-checked before? Okay, we get fact-checked by our kids, we get fact-checked by strangers on the internet. There's a lot of times in which we are told that we are wrong, and it's a very shaming thing. It's nothing new necessarily, but it's a lot more prominent. We live in a culture in which we need to be right. We need to have facts. We need to have the answers. We need to know what's going on. We need to be perfect. But yet we intellectually know that that is impossible. It's impossible to work from a space of having the answers. It's impossible to know what to say before you even know what the question is. It's impossible to always get it right. And we live in a world, and I dare say in our own faith community, where getting it right is so important that often we do nothing because we don't want to do the wrong thing. But what do we miss out on when we do that? So when I give myself permission to be fully who I am in any given space, I'm giving myself permission to be messy, to get it wrong, to stumble over my words, to not have the right words, to not have the answers. And it's a lot of pressure to not have the answers when you are one of the ministers who's supposed to have the answers. But I find myself often stuck, not wanting to bring my full self. But when we all decide to bring our full selves, we get these opportunities to find the answers together. However, it becomes challenging when our full selves are problematic. When there's parts of ourselves that we don't like or that are literally a problem. When there are parts of ourselves that are unsavory, that we want to fix or that we want to change. When there's parts of each other that we want to fix or change. And definitely in our larger world. We don't live in a perfect world because we're not perfect people. So what do we do when bringing our full self could be even dangerous? So, Thich Nhat Hanh, celebrated Zen Buddhist monk, has this to say. If you feel irritation or depression or despair, recognize their presence and practice this mantra. Dear one, I'm here for you. You should talk to your depression or your anger just as you would to a child. You embrace it tenderly with the energy of mindfulness and say, Dear one, I know you are there, and I'm going to take care of you, just as you would with a crying baby. There's no discrimination or dualism here, because compassion and love are you, but anger is too. All three organic in nature, so you don't need to be afraid. You can transform them. He says, let me repeat, the practice of Buddhist meditation, we do not turn ourselves into a battlefield of good versus evil. The good must take care of the evil as a big brother takes care of his little brother, or as a big sister takes care of her little sister, with a great deal of tenderness and a spirit of non-duality, knowing that there is a lot of peace within you already. Now, that's a message that is really liberating and relieving in some ways for the self. I don't have to eradicate parts of me that I don't like. I don't have to toil at getting rid of them. It's not a game of perfection. It's not a zero-sum game. It's very liberating to do that with oneself. It gets a little harder with each other. Gets a little harder to hold those parts of one another in our lives that we don't like, and it's even more difficult and nearly impossible in the larger world to hold those parts and to embrace those parts. But what he is saying is that you can't select which parts of yourself to deal with, and you can't select which parts of each other to deal with. You can't look at your kid and say, well, I'm going to feed you only if you're behaving. You can't look at your spouse and say, I'm only going to love you when you're in a good mood. You can't look at your coworker and say, we're only going to collaborate when you're doing exactly what I want you to do. You can't look at yourself and say, I'm only going to take care of myself when I'm feeling good. You don't get to select which parts to deal with, just like we can't in the larger world. We can't look at the world around us and say, I only want to face the things that make sense to me. I only want to work on the things that directly affect me. I only want to care about the things that feel good and are working out, because guess what? We're all on this planet together and we don't get that choice. What happens to any of us happens to all of us. We don't get to select which parts to deal with, but what Thich Nhat Hanh is saying is that we must embrace it. We must embrace that which is difficult, that which is complicated, that which is complex, because of course everything is. Now, to embrace does not mean to condone. Embrace does not mean to shrug your shoulders and say, oh, well, that's just the way it is, that's just the way I am. I'm not going to do anything about it because that's life. To embrace something is to face it and to hold it and then to transform it. And that's what Thich Nhat Hanh is talking about in terms of the mindfulness in the Buddhist tradition. What does it mean to transform the world that we live in? What does it mean to transform ourselves? What does it mean to stop battling ourselves and stop battling each other and look at the way that we take the energy that we exchange in that and transform it to something to we maybe have a world that we can actually live in together? What does it mean to transform how we feel about ourselves, how we feel about each other, and how we approach the world together? So that brings us to a really difficult topic, and I think it's pertinent to what we're seeing in our world. I know if you're anything like me, you cannot log on to anything, you can't get online, watch the TV without seeing a new catastrophe, a new act of violence, a new act of terror. This is quite a time to be alive. We have so much access to each other. We also have so much access to trauma. We have so many opportunities to harm and to hurt each other, and there's a lot of wonderful, amazing things happening in the world, but it's hard to tap into that in these times. When we look at the mass shootings that happen, we look at the massive acts of violence, we look at these ways that fascism is spreading in our country and across Europe, we look at the ways that we are using borders and fences and walls to keep people out. These are functions of white supremacy. So a little brief thing on white supremacy. White supremacy is a system of power. And now there's a lot of things this power is predicated upon. We can look at three: race, class, gender. So white supremacy says that there's a normative way of being, the right normative way of being in terms of race, class, and gender. Now, the further away you are from that, the more marginalized you are. So if you can fit into the mold of white supremacy, if you're right here with white supremacy, then you're privileged by it. But the further away you get, you are marginalized. So what white supremacy seeks to do is it seeks to categorize us and say, this is the right way to be. This is the right gender. This is the right race. This is the right class status. This is the right one way to be. And so there is a shadow side of showing up with your full self. And that is that it's inherently vulnerable and inherently dangerous in a world that's running on a system that seeks to define us all in really rigid binary categories. To show up with our full selves is actually an act of defiance. To show up with our full selves and who we are threatens that system of white supremacy, because it says that I can love who I need to love, and I will present how I present, and I am who I am, and you can't categorize me, and I will release myself of these chains. And that's very threatening to a system that needs us all to fall in line We subvert those systems. We break them down. We tear down those walls when we show up with our full selves. A lot is on the line. And we see that in this death rattle, this violence that's spreading because it knows it's on its way out. Enough of us are becoming liberated. Enough of us are saying, this is on my terms, and this is my life, and I'm going to live the way that I need to live. There's a shadow side of your full self, and it's in that danger of showing up as who you are. To show up and be seen as our full selves has these aspects that can get us into trouble, that can be dangerous, but ultimately it's incredibly important. If we think of in our own lives, in our interactions with each other, but also if we think of in the larger context, if we think of what it means in terms of our social movements to show up fully as who we are, if we think of what it means to transform rather than conquer, when we talk about power and those locus of power, the object is not necessarily to get that power in our hands, but to spread the power out, to have power with rather than power over. That's what happens when we show up with our full selves. We spread that out. We widen the circle. We let more people in. We say there's not one right way to be. There's not one right way to live. There's not one way to be a Unitarian Universalist. There's not one way to be in our bodies. There's not one way when we show up as our full selves. We create those possibilities together to share power, to transmute it, and ultimately to transform it. The challenges of today call us into more authentic ways of being, and we're called into different and new ways of belonging with one another as well. And while none of us really knows where we're going to be called in all of this, how we're going to be called to come forward and be seen, we know that we can only really do it together. Just like the story from the Upanishads, it teaches us the possibility of the seed within the seed. The Christian scriptures also instruct us to be transformed by the renewing of our minds. And Zen Buddhism mindfulness instructs us to hold tenderly each part of ourselves. Bearing witness to the transformation that is possible when we bring our full selves is to embrace and to face and to hold the fullness of this world. Transformation is when the Central Synagogue in Manhattan opens its doors to 600 Muslims just a few days ago as an act of solidarity and love. Transformation is the Parkland survivors who were not content with our thoughts and prayers, who were not content to stand by while the same thing kept happening, and they pushed for reform, and they continue to do that to this day. Transformation is resistance across borders from Texas to Palestine, the resistance of saying you will not keep love out, to stop trying, and that we will break through. Transformation is waking up and deciding, each of us, to come together today, even in the face of hate and fear and bigotry and confusion. Transformation is what happens when we love ourselves and when we choose that freedom over that fear. To experience, to encounter, to witness is to transform. And to transform is to get free. So friends, let's get free together, because literally we have no other choice. May it be so. Blessed be.